Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today with my guest, Topiler. Ina is a board-certified clinical nutritionist with over 16 years of experience in clinical practice. She is also the host of the Health Mysteries Solved podcast, where she gets to the real root of health issues. She's obsessed with all things related to natural health and ways we can optimize it, as she struggled and subsequently overcame many health ailments herself, ranging from IBS to debilitating fatigue to migraines to severe acne and thyroid issues. Now that she is out the other side, she doesn't want others to suffer like she did. I'm looking forward to talking all things thyroid, Hashimoto's, and health in general in today's episode. Ina, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Me too, and we have a lot of things we're going to unpack today when it comes to thyroid, metabolism, fat loss, and Hashimoto's. But before we do that, when I was doing the research for this podcast, I said to you right before we came on air, your health history, and it makes so much sense now. I was on your podcast, Health Mystery Solved, and I listened to several episodes, and it makes sense why you're so passionate about the topic based on where you came from. So for everybody listening, can you tell us a little bit about your health history and kind of what led you on the path you're on currently?
Absolutely. So I remember feeling tired and off since I was a little girl. Honestly, I remember being like 5 or 6 years old and just feeling like I was sick a lot. I remember my mom like chasing after me with like shots of penicillin because I was always sick and just not feeling well. But fast forward to high school, I started getting really bad acne. I was feeling tired, same in college. And at that point, I had a lot of other issues, but I think as a young girl, I obviously cared about what I looked like. And so the acne was my biggest concern. And I started to research that. And at first, I did a lot of the things that traditional doctors recommended. So I did antibiotics, lots and lots of antibiotics, and all these topicals with, oh my gosh, who knows how many different chemicals were in those. And nothing helped. I actually even had to do Accutane, but that made me feel so much worse. That's so harsh on the liver. But at that point, I was also experiencing fatigue. I actually started out working on Wall Street in New York City. I was in a finance job, and it was a 9-to-5 job. And at 5 o'clock, I would take the bus home, and I would just fall asleep on the bus. It was a 15-minute ride from downtown New York to Midtown, and I would fall asleep on the bus. My friends were all going out. We were living in the city. It was like the time to, just like the lifetime of your life, essentially. But I just wanted to sleep, and I, had like my motivation was off. My skin was really off. I had IBS. I had a lot of menstrual cycle issues, like a lot of PMS, a lot of cramping, a lot of headaches, where I really had to plan my day based on what my cycle was doing. Plus, it was also unpredictable, which made it hard to plan. And I knew that there was something going on, but every doctor that I went to was just trying to give me more medicine. And I was a really good patient. I took everything. I did everything they said, but I didn't get better. I just got worse. And, I had so many different specialists, and they had all this blood work, and everyone saying everything is fine. There's nothing wrong. I went to a gastroenterologist, a dermatologist, a gynecologist, endocrinologist, and everything was fine. And it just made me feel like, what's wrong with me, right? And they almost blamed me. And I felt like, in a way, I blamed myself because there's nothing wrong. Why am I feeling this way? But I knew something was going on. And that's when I really started to research and put things together, because none of my specialists were talking to each other. And then finally, I saw someone who diagnosed me with Hashimoto's. And I was so excited. And I know this must sound funny because you must be thinking, why are you excited to have an autoimmune disease? And for those that are listening and are not familiar, Hashimoto's is the autoimmune disease where your thyroid is being attacked by your own immune system. But I was excited because I thought, oh my gosh, yay, finally there's something wrong. Now we could fix it. I'm like, all right, let's go. What are we going to do? What's happening here? And the doctor's like, well, your thyroid is fine. So your immune system is attacking the thyroid, but it hasn't really attacked it that much. So there's nothing you can do. And I was like, excuse me. And at this point, we're going back over 20 years. I was not educated in the health field or nutrition, but even in my sort of lay kind of mind, I still knew, but how do you not do anything? The doctor essentially said that eventually the thyroid attack is going to, it's going to continue. It's going to get stronger. Eventually, my immune system will destroy my thyroid. And at that point, when it gets destroyed and my lab levels show that my thyroid function is low, then she'll give me medicine, and I'll have to take this medicine forever. And I was like, okay, I don't really like this whole idea. Right? It didn't make sense to me, even though, again, I wasn't as educated on nutrition or health at that point. And so that's when I really started to research more. And so even though this diagnosis was kind of the beginning of everything. It felt like kind of the end, but it was really the beginning of everything else. And that's when I started looking into functional medicine and nutrition. I found a clinical nutritionist who did a functional medicine approach, which is what I practice now as well. And we did all of these other tests. So not just simple blood work. We did a really expanded thyroid analysis. And in fact, I did have some thyroid issues. Even though the doctor said my thyroid is fine, it's because my TSH, which we'll get into in much more detail, was normal, but my other labs really were suboptimal. I also had a lot of heavy metals. So I had mercury, I had copper, I had candida, which is a type of overgrowth in the gut. I had different stagnations in liver pathways. There was just so many different things. And what was neat, and again, I was excited, but in this case, it was good because the doctor that I was working with actually had ideas for me and things that we can do. So it wasn't like, oh, you have this one disease, right? It was more like, okay, you have this, but what's causing it is all of these other things, right? So it's the gut imbalance and the adrenal stuff and the thyroid and the heavy metals. And so we started working on that one by one. And it wasn't easy. It took some time. But after changing my diet, doing different supplements and cleansing and really supporting my system, things really started to resolve. And one by one, my skin got better, my IBS disappeared, my energy got better. I noticed my hair started growing a lot more. It was always kind of thin and short. So I just saw all of that just change. And again, it wasn't overnight. I do want to make it clear that it took time, but I really felt like my body was actually healing from the inside, which was amazing. And then that's what got me to essentially change careers and going from Wall Street to now for over 17 years now, I've been in clinical nutrition.
And when I think of your mess becoming your message as a saying, I think exactly when you're putting out your content, either through the podcast or through social media. And it's unfortunate trend that I'm getting now in recent weeks with people talking about PCOS, thyroid function, Hashimoto's, that they feel left or let down by traditional Western medicine because of that kind of symptomatic treating things in isolation as opposed to looking at it as a whole. And I think for people listening, hearing your story, if they're in a similar position starting off or midway through their journey, it gives them that uplift that they can get out the other side and that their approach is either right or you have feedback on what you're doing now might not be the best approach and you might need to look at alternative routes like you did, Ina, and again, you're out the other side now. I want to pull it back to thyroid just because this is a topic previously unexplored on the podcast, although it comes up in bits and pieces. We've never done a deep dive on it. Talk to us, and I think it'll work as a nice little catalyst or a jumping off point. Talk about why the thyroid is so important, and then we can go from there.
Oh gosh, the thyroid is so important. So a lot of people may know about thyroid a little bit and they know that, oh yes, it's responsible for metabolism and it's responsible for energy, and it is, but we need thyroid hormone for literally everything, like from our head to our toes. So thyroid, of course, yes, is responsible for energy and metabolism, but also like keeping our body temperature. It's responsible for our mood. It's responsible for our digestion. A lot of people don't realize that connection, especially if someone has a little bit of a slower motility or they're constipated, right? Yes, there could be gut stuff going on, but the thyroid controls that. The thyroid also is responsible about what's going to be going on in your liver and your gallbladder. So people can have high cholesterol, they can have toxicity issues or issues with detoxification, which is a really, really important thing, especially when you're talking about weight loss, fat loss, body composition. You really, really need to have good liver and gallbladder function for that. And the thyroid is at the core of that. Our sleep is related to thyroid. Also our skin, our hair. And I've had hand experience with so many things with skin and hair, and it could be not just hair loss. So that's a big thing with thyroid, but also just hair thinning or just hair not growing that well. People tell me often, oh, my hair grows to like right here and then I can't get it any longer. Thyroid is often associated with that. So there's a lot.
With the thyroid, Ina, just out of curiosity, and I definitely have a gap in my education around this particular area, is it mostly females that tend to struggle with it, or do you find males struggle with it too, or is it predominantly gender specific?
It is more females than males. So here's why. And when we talk about thyroid, of course, just to kind of give everyone a little bit of like a general explanation, your thyroid in a general sense could be either, say, normal if there's nothing going on, or it could be hypo, which means slow, or it could be hyper, which is fast. Now, I predominantly focus on hypo, which is slow thyroid. And usually, for everyone listening to this podcast, as I know everyone's interested in fat loss and metabolism overall, it would be more of issues with slow thyroid that would affect that. So when the thyroid is slow, it causes all of those symptoms that we had just discussed, the low energy, poor hair, poor metabolism, low mood, things like that. When the thyroid is fast or hyper, that's usually the opposite. So people feel kind of very wired. They may have more oilier skin, oilier hair. They may have heart palpitation. Things are kind of fast. So, and again, that's important, but it is, I would say, usually more of an issue with slow. There's many more people that have hypo than hyper. And so we'll predominantly speak about this today. Now, with this, what a lot of people don't realize is what causes hypothyroidism, right? Well, there's many different things, your genetics, family history, but actually, do you know what the number one reason of hypothyroidism?
No.
It is actually Hashimoto's. So Hashimoto's is the autoimmune disease, right, as we just talked about. So it's when your immune system destroys your own thyroid. So it is estimated that I would say at least 80%, but there are people that are saying it could be even 90% or more of hypothyroidism cases. Those are caused by Hashimoto's, so your own immune system attacking it. Because what happens is that if there's an attack and the immune system keeps attacking it, eventually it's going to damage it and destroy it, and the thyroid is not going to work as well and hence become hypo. So back to answering your question, it is more female dominant. And the reason is that autoimmune disease in general is more common in women. The reason for that is that autoimmune disease, of course, there's many, many different factors that affect autoimmunity, our environment, the toxins or infections or stress or foods, but hormonal fluctuations are another big, big thing that affects autoimmunity. And so if you think about a female versus a male, right, what happens with females? Well, we have our monthly cycle, right? And so from age, say, 12 or 13 to 50, what are our hormones doing? Up, down, up, down, right? Estrogen goes up and down, progesterone goes up and down. So there's a lot of fluctuations. And then, of course, obviously we have puberty when they start to doing that. Also women with pregnancies, there's postpartum, which is a huge hormonal shift, right? From pregnancy to postpartum, it's like really high and then really low. And then menopause. Now, if you look at men, you see really testosterone, right? Men have a little bit of estrogen and progesterone, but it doesn't really cycle the way it does for women. So it's mostly testosterone. And when men go through puberty, right, the testosterone goes up and then it kind of stays up the whole time. And then eventually it starts to decline as men get older, right? So there's not this fluctuation. So it's pretty steady, right? With women, it's up, down, up, down, up, down for 30, 40, 50 years, right? So, of course, again, I don't want to generalize too much because there is a lot of other reasons that affect autoimmunity, but this fluctuation in hormones that happens in women that doesn't happen in men is one of the big reasons as to why I believe, and a lot of people believe, that women have more autoimmune diseases. And so, sorry, this is a very long answer to your question, but that's the reason why. But I think it's important to understand kind of why, so people, can connect that. That's why thyroid issues, especially hypothyroidism, is more common in women. Not to say that it doesn't happen to men. It does. And men have Hashimoto's too. But I would say like maybe 80% women, at least from what I see through my programs and in my practice.
That's really helpful. And that's given me kind of an unintentional segue, because I know you covered this a lot on your content through Instagram and on the podcast, that a lot of people are misdiagnosed with hypothyroidism. Why is that? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So traditionally, the way that you are diagnosed with hypothyroidism is by looking at something called TSH, which is the thyroid stimulating hormone. Now, thyroid stimulating hormone is very important, and it does tell us a lot. However, it's only one hormone out of about 10 different hormones that are important. And we'll get into that in just a second. But the other thing that's important is the lab ranges. So typically, when you look at lab ranges, and here in the US, we have some of the main labs are LabCorp or Quest, but there's many different labs out there, and they have ranges where, they try to include about 95% of the population. So just to give you an example for TSH, a typical lab range is about 0.5 to 4.5. It actually used to be 0.5 to 5.0, but they've lowered it a little bit. Even still, though, that's a very wide range. And that includes a lot of people who can have a lot of different health issues and symptoms. Optimally, TSH really should be between about 1.8 and 3. And this is for people who are not on medication. If they're on medication, it's a little bit different. But typically between 1.8 and 3. So you can see it's the middle of the range. It's much more narrow. So one of the reasons why people are misdiagnosed is they may have a TSH of 3.5 or 4, And most doctors will say, well, that's still in the range. It's not flagged, doesn't have that like H, the red H next to it, right? And they'll say, oh, it's fine. You're okay. But if you're above 3, that's really an indication that something is happening and it's not flagged, right? And let's say someone goes to the doctor today and their TSH is 4. The doctor says, oh, you're fine. Come back in a year. And, maybe they have something going on. They don't come back they come back in a year and a half, right? Because that's really common. Like people don't always get their physicals right at the time. And then in that year and a half, a lot can happen. Their TSH could go up to 4.4, right? And doctors say, oh, you're still under 4.5. You're fine, right? They come back in another year and a half. Now they're over. But think about how long at this point their thyroid has been off. Now it's been 3 years that they could have been doing something and they have symptoms that, are coming. And then the other thing, so that the lab range I think is really important, and it's all about being in the middle or the optimal range. But then the second thing that's also very, very important is looking at all of the different thyroid markers. I'd like to just give you a little bit of a summary because I think, and again, I promise I won't get too scientific, but just so that your audience has an understanding of what actually happens with thyroid hormones. Because a lot of people may have heard of TSH or their doctor told them, oh, your TSH is fine. But TSH is one out of many hormones. So TSH is produced in the brain, actually in the pituitary. And then TSH stimulates the thyroid. Our thyroid then goes to produce 2 hormones, T4 and T3. So what's important to know here is T4 is kind of like the pro or inactive hormone, and T3 is our active hormone. So T3 is what goes to all of our cells. So that's what helps our metabolism and weight loss. That's what helps our energy, our hair, our skin, mood, all of that. What's interesting though is your body produces about 93% T4 and only about 7% T3. Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, that's weird. Why would the body do that? T3 is the good one, right? Not the good, but the more important one or the more active one, right? Well, the reason is our body's really smart. Our body always has a reason, and our body's really smart. And so if T3 was produced in the thyroid right here, then it would be used by the cells here, and there wouldn't be enough for thyroid hormone to go all through the body. Because remember, we were saying you need thyroid hormone for everything, head to toe. So what the body does is it produces mostly T4, and then it takes that T4 and it converts it to T3. Now, in order for it to convert, there's specific things that it needs. So it needs certain nutrients like zinc or selenium. It also gets converted in the liver and the gut. So those areas need to work well. And then the body also has to get that hormone to the liver and the gut to get it to convert. So it shuttles it on proteins. I almost call it like, if you can imagine hormones sitting on a bus, right? Because they can't be just hanging out on their own. So it gets chaperoned or sits on this bus and goes into the liver and gets converted. And then after it gets converted, it then has to travel around and go to the cells that need the hormone. And then it has to enter and get into the cell. So there's all of these different steps. So TSH could be okay, right? And you can even produce enough T4. And most doctors will test TSH, and then they'll also test T4. And you can have normal TSH, normal T4. But what if you're someone that doesn't convert? And that's really, really common because someone can have poor liver function. And it doesn't mean that they have to be sick or their liver is dying. It could be just stagnation or toxicity or just eating certain foods that are clogging up the liver, right? It also converts in the gut. So you can have someone who has a lot of dysbiosis, which is basically an imbalance of different bacteria in the gut. And so they may not be converted because of that, or they may be missing nutrients to convert. So now this person can have normal T4, but very low T3. And as we were saying, T3 is active. So if the doctor doesn't test T3, they would completely miss it. Now, there's also something that I call thyroid types. And within the sort of hypothyroid realm, right, of having slow thyroid is really not a one-size-fits-all approach. So we want to make sure that we're really categorizing people based on their type. And so if someone has low T3, I call it the low T3 type. I know it's not the most original name, but it's very easy to understand and remember, right? If someone has a high TSH, above 3, that would be a high TSH type. But then there's all of these other different subtypes. So someone can have hormones like, say, their T4 and T3 that are bound to proteins that are traveling on that bus. And those may be low, whereas the hormones that are available to the cells could be high or vice versa. And those are other types. So, there's a lot of different kind of nuances with that. And it's just really, I think, important to know that there's just so much more than TSH that happens with thyroid. And that's why it's so important to really look at a full thyroid panel. A full thyroid panel will actually include the TSH, of course, but also the total T4, which is the T4 on the bus, the free T4, which is when it jumps off the bus and is ready for the cell, and then a total T3 and free T3. So total T3 is the T3 on the bus. Free T3 is the T3 that's jumping off, getting ready to get into the cell. And then there's something called reverse T3. And reverse T3 is a marker that's almost like the opposite of T3. So you know how we were saying you really need T3 for all of your functions? The reverse, it acts, think about it almost as like an overflow valve. So if for some reason your body overconverts too much, into too much T3, the body has this overflow valve that it goes to reverse just so you don't have too much T3, because then they'll make you too hyper or make you lose too much weight, right? Or give you, hair that's, maybe too greasy or skin that's very oily. And so there's always this check and balances. You want to have a balance between T3 and reverse. But in some situations, people can have too much reverse. And if you have too much reverse, you can't utilize your regular T3. So that's an important marker to check too. And oftentimes if someone has a lot of stress or a lot of inflammation in the body, they can create more of this reverse T3. And so a little bit of it is okay, but too much is going to block regular T3. So that's an important marker. And then another marker is T3 uptake. This is very, very rarely used, but I include that in a full thyroid panel. And what's interesting about T3 uptake is it basically looks at the sites that are available for T3 to bond to, but it also tells me about a specific thyroid type that I call the unavailable hormones type. So if someone has a T3 uptake that is less than optimal, that actually means that their hormones are less available. And what's interesting there is they can have thyroid hormone, they can go to the doctor and doctor will say, oh, everything is fine. But yet we could tell from that marker, if the hormones are less available, they're not going to be getting into the cell. So they're there, but they're like essentially not available. So I really like that marker. And then finally, and very importantly, is the Hashimoto's markers. So those are antibodies to your thyroid. There's two of them, thyroid peroxidase antibody and thyroglobulin antibody. And it's a little bit, sometimes people get confused because they wonder, well, what does it mean? How do you know if you have Hashimoto's? So it's actually simple. If you have antibodies that are above the lab's range of either one of the antibodies, that means Hashimoto's. And people contact me a lot on Instagram, and they'll ask me, I just got my labs. Can you take a look? Like, do I have Hashimoto's? My doctor said they weren't sure. And I'm like, what do you mean they weren't sure? It's pretty black and white. Like, you have it or you don't. And typically the lab's range for antibodies is, anything under 35 is normal, and they don't really quantify. So it could be 34, it could be 12. Most labs don't quantify. But if it's above that, then it's Hashimoto's. So if it's 40, 100, 200,000, whatever it is, then it's Hashimoto's. And you don't have to have both antibodies. As long as either one of the antibodies is elevated, that is how Hashimoto's would be diagnosed by a doctor.
Oh, there's loads there. I definitely am going to pull it back to hypothyroidism, the kind of the symptoms, the causes, the treatment. But before we do that, you've given so much value for people that the diagnosis is key. Make sure that you're getting the right panels done, the right interpretation of those, so you know exactly what's going on. But what's the difference between, and again, huge gap in my knowledge on this, what's the difference between hypothyroidism and Hashimoto's?
So a lot of times people will have both. I actually did a poll on Instagram not that long ago, just asking people, do you have one or the other? And I'd say 96% said they have both. So hypothyroidism is when you actually don't have enough thyroid hormone. So your TSH is not right, and your thyroid hormone T4 and T3 are going to be deficient. And so usually people who have hypothyroidism will be on medication or should be on some type of thyroid support. Hashimoto's is when your immune system attacks your own thyroid. So a lot of times, because the immune system attacks, it's going to also then destroy your thyroid and create hypothyroidism, which is why people have both. There are people, of course, who have hypothyroidism and don't have Hashimoto's. It happens. And, that can be because of, genetics. Sometimes also you can have, when you're younger, some type of a virus that can invade the thyroid and can make it slow. Radiation exposure. So like post Chernobyl, for example, there's a lot of thyroid issues that came out of that. I think that's partly where mine came from. And so, again, it's possible to have hypo without Hashimoto's, but typically people are going to see both. Now, what you can also see is you can have Hashimoto's without hypo, but that's temporary. So what I mean is that if someone has a doctor who's very willing to run all the labs and to, really kind of look at everything, they may see Hashimoto's antibodies, meaning there is this immune attack, And then, and this is what happened with me initially, when they look at all the other thyroid markers, TSH, T4, T3, those are normal. So what that means is the immune attack is already there, but it takes time for thyroid to get destroyed. So what's really neat here is that they caught it early. So there is immune attack. We know that there's Hashimoto's. It just hasn't destroyed the thyroid enough where the thyroid is showing signs of being hypo. And in most situations, which unfortunately, and the same thing happened to me, doctors will say, there's nothing you can do, right? Just wait. And then after it gets destroyed, you'll get on medicine. But I just really, really want people to understand that there's nothing further from the truth because there is so much that we can do. When it comes to Hashimoto's, it's not the thyroid's fault it's being attacked, right? Just like in cases of MS, it's not the brain's fault it's being attacked. Or in arthritis, it's not the joint's fault that it's being attacked. It's the immune system got confused for whatever reason and just thought that the thyroid isn't your friend, right? And so typically that immune confusion comes from somewhere. And, I like to look at, there's 4 main areas. Of course, there's a lot of sub areas, but there's 4 main areas that creates that. So these are things like the foods you're eating, the toxins you're exposed to, the infections that you may have, and not your typical cold, let's say, but, things like, candida overgrowth, right? Or parasites, or even certain, viruses like Epstein-Barr virus, which a lot of times can be dormant, but then kind of reactivate and rear its ugly head. And our stress affects that. So when we look at those things and support them, and we can do that through foods and nutrients, then we can balance the immune system. So in cases where there's Hashimoto's without hypo, we can do stuff to hopefully help and prevent it from going to hypo, or at least slow it down.
Yeah, I definitely want to spend quite a bit of time on how we can support hypothyroidism. But before we do that, the symptoms of hypothyroidism. So I've worked with people in the past, body composition, weight loss, fat loss, who have a thyroid issue, normally hypothyroidism, as you've mentioned. The main symptom that I normally see with people is this, obviously struggling to lose weight. What are some of the other symptoms that people would have that are kind of very common? And then can you explore why it's so important for metabolism and fat loss that our thyroid is functioning either optimally or we're supporting it in the case of hypothyroidism? Because obviously we both know this from our areas of expertise that metabolism and fat loss, they go hand in hand. Mm-hmm. Talk to us a little bit about the symptoms of hypothyroidism, and then we'll jump into metabolism and fat loss and how the thyroid impacts that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So symptoms, as you mentioned, hard to lose weight. And that could be, a lot of times hard to lose fat. I mean, people can lose water, right? But that's not really helpful. So it's going to be hard to lose fat. People often feel that, they could be perfect. They eat they follow the plan, they do everything. And even when they are absolutely perfect, they will maybe not gain, but then they won't lose. And then, they eat one thing off of their plan and they gain a pound or 2. Mm. Now, of course, obviously, thyroid is not the only reason. There's other things that can cause that. But if the thyroid is not optimal, these are the things that we notice. Now, also fatigue is a big one. And that could be fatigue throughout the whole day. It could be fatigue at certain times of the day where people are sort of feeling like their energy is like this. Mood swings and just poor mood. So depression, anxiety, things with digestion. So a lot of times we see slow transit time. So constipation, or, people will say, oh yeah, I go to the bathroom every day, but I always ask them, but tell me a little bit more, right? Like, is it hard? Is it soft? They're like, oh yeah, I go every day. I'm like, well, does it look like pellets? And they're like, oh yeah, it's like little balls. So to me, in my book, that's constipation, right? Yes, you're going every day, but it's like very little. It's just, you're not really moving stuff. And because also thyroid affects how our bile and the gallbladder is working, that also slows things down. So, and a lot of times when people have constipation, that will also then create more gas and more bloating and distension. And, so all of those things can often go and be symptoms of hypothyroidism. Hair that's dry, hair loss, hair thinning, hair that doesn't grow, nails that break a lot, sleep that's disrupted. So even though people feel tired, a lot of times at night, they're not able to sleep very well through the night. And that's thyroid related as well. So, of course, there's many, many different ones, but these are probably the main ones that I see. Brain fog actually is another one. So thyroid is very important for our brain because it maintains the blood-brain barrier, which is the membrane that surrounds our brain. So it kind of tells things what can go into the brain and what can't. And we certainly don't want all the different toxins and chemicals going in. And for those that are not familiar, brain fog, it's just kind of feeling off and foggy and out of it and just not clear, almost like when you have allergies, it kind of feels like that, even not during allergy season.
Just to pull it back and go into metabolism and fat loss there with it, one of the things that I've done with clients in the past, and I'd love to hear your expertise on this in terms of what you've experienced either working with people or even in your own personal life, because I know this is something that affected you once upon a time. I always had to align the expectations of clients with an issue with thyroid, meaning that we could still reduce body fat and we could still lose weight. It just took considerably longer than somebody whose thyroid was functioning perfectly or they had no underlying issue. Do you, or have you found that people with hypothyroidism in particular, there's things they can do that can support their fat loss or weight loss goals? So I know there's generally supporting hypothyroidism for health and wellness and energy, but when it comes to weight loss, fat loss, body composition, is there anything that jumps out at you that works quite well for people when it comes to supporting that?
So just to make sure I understand your question, that if they have hypothyroidism and it's not supported, you're saying to help with fat loss.
Yeah. So apologies. So to clarify that, when I've worked with people in the past, I've been able to take control of their nutrition, take control of their sleep, their recovery, their training, all of those elements. And obviously based on how they're feeding back, I would have an expectation of time. So general rule would be, it takes at least double. So if what would normally take somebody 6 weeks, it could take somebody with an issue with a thyroid 12 weeks, just to align those expectations.
Sure.
What do you find supports people with hypothyroidism when it comes to weight loss and fat loss in particular?
Gotcha. Okay. So I think that this actually depends on the type of thyroid type they have within the hypothyroidism realm. I know you do such amazing work and you look at so many different factors with your clients and students, and all of those things are so important for thyroid as well, right? Because it's just such a holistic approach. So typically, it depends, of course, on how slow the thyroid really is. But typically, I see this as well, where like things could happen in terms of weight loss and fat loss. It just takes a little bit longer, but it depends on, how slow it really is. So a lot of times, if it's more subclinical hypothyroidism, meaning their TSH is not that high and maybe their hormones are just a little off. And let's say they're a low T3 type where they don't convert so well. Well, we mentioned before, right, that with conversion, you need good liver function, good gut function, you need some important nutrients like zinc and selenium. So with all of the amazing work that you do, right, you're putting them on a really healthy diet, right? They're exercising, they're doing mindset. I know you do so much around mindset, which I think is huge for stress. And so by doing all of that, that can actually take the burden off of their liver. And by eating well, especially if they're eating foods that are more fermented and taking probiotics, right, they can even do some gut cleanup, even without realizing that they're doing it, just by changing their diet and taking some nutrients, they can be cleaning up their gut. So for those people, what can happen is if they're a low T3 type, they can actually start to convert better from all of the things that you're doing. And with that, and it takes a couple of months, let's say. So as they're doing that, their thyroid is actually getting better, and then they're starting to lose more weight. So it's kind of working together, if you know what I mean. Now, in other situations, let's just say someone is like a very textbook hypothyroid case where their TSH is too high, meaning, say it's out of the lab's range, 6 or 7, right? And their thyroid hormones are really low. It's going to be very hard for them to really do anything, lose weight, have energy, have good hair. It's kind of like thinking about if, you're going about your life, but you're wearing ski boots. It's really hard to walk in ski boots. Those things are heavy, right? So, it can happen, of course, but it's a lot harder. And I also believe that when your thyroid is not optimal, especially when things are really out of range, you do want to support it. And sometimes, I have people, obviously, that are in my community that want to do everything natural. And as a clinical nutritionist, I try to do everything natural as much as I can. And once in a while, people do sound a little surprised if I say, you know what, some medicine might be helpful in your case, because they think, well, wait a minute, you're a nutritionist and you're supposed to do things all naturally. I'm surprised that you're saying that I should ask my doctor about medicine. But I find that when it comes to thyroid and thyroid medicine specifically, I don't even really think of it as medicine the way I would think of, an antibiotic or a cholesterol medicine or something like that. Thyroid medicine is essentially thyroid hormone. So if you don't have enough thyroid hormone, you literally you don't have what you need to do all of its things. And when you don't have enough thyroid hormone, you start to, it's not just, oh, okay, I'm going to gain a little bit of weight, right? But our gut breaks down. Our brain, as we were just saying, that blood-brain barrier breaks down. Our liver isn't going to function as well. Our gallbladder, like if we're not moving our bowels, everything is just sitting there, right? So there's a lot of damage that can happen. And so I look at thyroid medicine as really replacing something essential that you don't have. So I don't look at it as a negative thing. And I'm not saying everyone needs to be on medicine. Of course, it's a case by case and depends on, what you're doing with your doctor. And there's a lot of things that can be fixed naturally. But if it's really hypo and TSH's often hormones are low, then, a little bit of medicine is typically recommended. And then that also would make it better. And I'll give you an example personally, because when I was going through school and my thyroid was already a little off, but at that point, I definitely had the mentality everything medicine was bad just because of my history, right? I took all these medicines, nothing worked. And I was like, I'm not taking medicine ever again, right? And I was always on the border. Like my TSH was like a 5, right? So it's like right out of the 4.5. I mean, now I know it was way off, but from a doctor's perspective, I was like, and my hormones were just a little bit low. And the doctor at that time was like, and I said, I'm like, I don't really want to take medicine. And they were like, okay, we can kind of watch and see. Well, really, I think they should have said, no, you need it. But I was like, no, I'm not doing it. And then once, and because of Hashimoto's, I already had that thyroid destruction. So even though you can prevent it and stop it from occurring further, there's not really a way to go back, right? So whatever was destroyed was already there. Now I'm very thankful that I haven't had nearly as much destruction, but that initial one is there. So once I started a small dose, and literally it was like a baby dose of thyroid medicine, literally it was like I woke up. It was just, just my hair, my energy, overall, just my metabolism. I noticed that, and thankfully, I would never had to really struggle with weight, but I didn't have to be so perfect, and I just saw better overall body composition. I saw the scale go down a little bit, and it was pretty instant. So, if someone really needs it, it is important.
With that then, and I couldn't agree more, I think you said it beautifully there, that it just adds back in what you're already missing, and it just it arms you with what you need to get your body to where it needs to be, especially, as you said, the danger being in the dose, making sure you're doing other things as well, I think is probably important, which we'll come on to now. When it comes to some of the best practices for supporting hypothyroidism, what would you recommend to people? Would you go straight to, obviously with the background in nutrition, would you go straight to nutrition? Do you look at sleep, supplementation? I know you mentioned zinc, selenium, which you can get nutrition and supplementation. What are some of the best practices for people who have hypothyroidism? Obviously the medication side, as you said, potentially can help and support, but what are the other things that people can do?
Okay, great. So there's a few different things. Now, it is a little bit individualized because it depends on thyroid type. But first and foremost, I think that people need to find out if they have hypo and Hashimoto's or only one or only the other, because you need to know that so that you're supporting it. Because I can't tell you how often people say, oh yes, I have Hashimoto's and hypothyroidism and I'm taking Synthroid, which is one of the most common popular thyroid medications. It's a T4. They said, so I'm supporting my Hashimoto's and hypothyroidism with Synthroid. Not true, right? You're supporting your hypothyroidism with Synthroid, but not Hashimoto's, right? Thyroid medication doesn't do anything to stop the immune response and stop the immune system from attacking the thyroid. The thyroid medication is giving you just that thyroid hormone. So if this is your thyroid and is your immune system, you're giving the thyroid hormone, so the thyroid is doing okay, and then the immune system is going, right? Like hitting the thyroid. So then what's going to happen is you're going to need more and more thyroid medicine over time. So I would say first thing is find out if you have one or both. And it is very common to have both. And so for the Hashimoto's itself, all of the lifestyle stuff is going to be huge. So everything that you talk about are the things that are going to be very important. So eating clean, eating healthy. Oftentimes food sensitivities play a big role, especially gluten and oftentimes dairy. So people with Hashimoto's tend to do really well on a gluten-free diet and often a dairy-free diet as well. But eating clean, eating foods that come from the earth, right? Making sure that we're supporting stress, because that's one of the big triggers. Making sure that we're supporting sleep, because guess what? If we don't sleep, then we're under physical stress of sleep deprivation. So anything we can do, and of course there's nutrients for that and a lot of mindset techniques for that to support that. And then making sure that we're getting physical activity. People with Hashimoto's and thyroid, I typically don't recommend that they overdo it, because if the body's already feeling weak and you do too much exercise, and when I say too much, 3 hours a day of boot camp and things like that, but, anything that is weight bearing, which I know you talk about so much, and there's so much benefit because, as you said on my podcast, you're burning fat for hours and hours after doing weight bearing exercise. And that's great too, because, it's still burning calories, right? But you're not in this like huffing and puffing and like really, really depleted state if you're already feeling tired. So of course, listening to your body and doing what you can, but doing something and moving your body daily is huge. So that's for the Hashimoto's, which a lot of that will help the hypothyroidism too, but that's going to depend on your thyroid type. So if you're someone who has a really high TSH and it's not supported, then you would want to speak to your doctor about making sure that you're on the right support. And when it comes to thyroid medication, there's like 10 different medications too. So it is helpful to work with someone that understands that, if you need T4, T3, or both. So we could do that. However, if you're someone that's a low T3 type and your T3 is suboptimal, then all of the lifestyle stuff will be very helpful because that helps the gut and the liver. And then taking nutrients like zinc and selenium are going to be helpful. If you're someone who is the unavailable hormones type, a lot of times other hormones relate here. So things like estrogen. So really doing things to watch and see, are we getting any exogenous estrogen, from foods that maybe animal products that have been fed antibiotics and hormones, looking at our beauty products, personal care products to make sure we don't have hormone disruptors like parabens in there. And I believe it's already banned in Europe. So you guys probably don't even have much of that. We still have it here and there in the US. So, really kind of having a clean lifestyle that way is going to help. One thing I do want to mention is a lot of thyroid supplements on the market, and many of them are wonderful. However, a lot of thyroid supplements contain iodine. And iodine is something that does help the thyroid because you need iodine to produce thyroid hormones. But iodine is actually contraindicated in Hashimoto's. And this has been sort of a controversial topic in the past, but there's so much research now, I don't think it's controversial anymore. Some doctors will still say, oh yeah, iodine is fine, but I would very politely disagree with that. And I know a lot of my colleagues and people in our community who's really done a lot of the research, see that iodine is contraindicated and can raise TSH and create other issues. So if
contraindicated, can you explain what contraindicated means for anyone unfamiliar with that term?
Sure, yes. So basically, if you have Hashimoto's, you do not want to take iodine. Iodine can make it worse. Now, a little bit of iodine, say if you have a multivitamin that has, maybe 100, 150 micrograms, that can often be okay. But a lot of thyroid supplements out there can have, they have zinc, selenium, they may have other ingredients, but they could have a large amount of iodine. And that's what you want to be careful with if you have Hashimoto's. If you don't have Hashimoto's and you're 100% sure that you do not, and you just have hypothyroidism, then iodine can be helpful, especially if you're deficient in iodine.
That's really good to know for people. I think it comes back to what you said on the diagnosis, making sure that you are clear on exactly what's going on. Is it hypothyroidism? Is it Hashimoto's? Is it a combination of both? I think that's so important for people. And you pulled out something there that I think is really, it jumped at me because I've had clients in the past when you said, don't do your 3 hours of exercise a day. And ironically, people who are struggling to lose weight with thyroidism, although their energy can be poor, can be tempted to do multiple hours of exercise per day because they're trying to lose the weight, they're trying to lose body fat, and there's a pull to, do more to get your weight down, get your fat loss down. And as you mentioned there, it's most likely going to be counterintuitive that you're doing more, which is putting more stress on the body, elevating cortisol, which is causing a whole host of issues, and it's completely counterintuitive. So I just wanted to put that back for the couple of people I've worked with in the past who I had to educate around this and talk to around this. So I'm so glad you put it. Ina, I love this conversation and you're doing fantastic work with the podcast. As I said, as I've been on it, I love the layout for anyone that wants to go and head over to Health Mystery Solved after this, where you take a case study and you break it down in the episode. It's just a fantastic way of doing a podcast. But I just have one final question. When you started back, and I think you're probably one of the best people to ask this because of your expertise now, but also based on where you came from, what's something you wish you knew starting off that you know now?
Well, I would say a couple of things. I mean, thyroid medicine, I would say hands down number one. I wish I would have started thyroid medicine sooner. I literally was kicking myself. And I know we chatted about that, but I was kicking myself after because within like 2 weeks, I had so much improvement. And again, I've had tons of improvement before I started. I'm not saying it was for nothing. I mean, all of that still needed to happen, but it would have gone faster. Yeah. And again, I mean, I also just want to be clear. I'm not saying everyone should be on thyroid medicine, right? You really want to evaluate your levels. But if your TSH is high and your T4 and T3 is low, and especially if your doctor is recommending, hey, you need something and you're fighting it because you're thinking, no, let me do it my way. You're denying your body of something that it really needs. So I would say that's probably number one. And then the second is, I wish that I knew more about the mind-body connection. So and I know we touched on it, but we talked about a lot of the biochemical stuff more today, which is important, but really it's a combination. So with my science background and everything, like, okay, there's this study and, this pathway goes this way and this pathway goes that way. And I love putting puzzle pieces together and like, oh, how does this connect to this and where does this go? It's really fun because, it works. I was very much thinking, okay, you need this amount of this vitamin to make this pathway go. So I'm going to take, exactly 98 milligrams of zinc because that's what it says, I've worked a lot on all of my other pathways and organs. So adrenal glands and liver and everything else. And I'll tell you a quick story. I did an adrenal test and there's many ways to test adrenals, but one of the best ways to, by the way, for everyone listening, the adrenals are the glands there are two little glands that sit on top of your kidneys and they're the ones that produce cortisol. So they support stress, but they also help us with energy. And adrenals and thyroid are very related. They're like sister glands. And so the best way to test adrenal glands is through doing a 4-point cortisol test, which you could do through saliva or urine, where you're testing the cortisol throughout the day to see, because it has to be a very specific curve. It starts high and goes down. And so when I tested mine, I saw that they were, the cortisol was lower than it needs to be. So that would indicate weaker or slower adrenals, which is super common for many people, but especially those that have issues with thyroid and hypothyroidism specifically. And I always knew that, I've had stress in the past and things like that. And there's a lot of wonderful nutrients for adrenals. So there are glandular supplements. There are supplements that are considered adaptogenic herbs. So things like ashwagandha, rhodiola, really, really popular right now. But we're going back like maybe 15 years or so. There's also supplements like DHEA. And so I tested my adrenals, but all right, they're weak. I'm like, okay, I'm going to take this glandular supplement. I'm going to take this adaptogenic herb. And they're all really wonderful things. Well, guess what happened? I took them for a week. My face broke out. And I am, because of my past history with acne, and my skin's much better now, but there's certain things I guess I'm still prone. And it broke out to the point where I'm like, oh yeah, this isn't good. But then I thought, maybe that's not it. Maybe it's something else. And I kind of just tried to ignore it. And I kept taking, I was like, I need these vitamins, and, it just got worse and worse. Then I look like a teenager again. So I'm like, yeah, no, I can't do that. And so I thought to myself, okay, well, what am I going to do? How am I going to support my adrenals? I can't take any of these herbs. And, I was lucky at that time. I was working with someone who was an energy healer and a body worker. And he said to me, have you tried meditation? And I said, what? Who? Me? I'm like, no. My mind's too busy. I don't do that stuff. And I'm like, I can't just sit still. And he said, meditation isn't just about sitting still. I'm like, yeah, I can't not think. And he's like, it's not just about not thinking. And anyways, long story short, he really introduced me to this whole world of, mindset in my body and taught me ways to really tune into my body, to listen to my own body, to support my energy. I don't have to stop thinking. We did walking meditation and guided meditation, a lot of different things. And I've done so much in that arena since then. And oh gosh, it's been, I said over 10 years. And I just never gave that enough thought. And so much has shifted since I started supporting that. So I wish I knew about it earlier as well.
I love it. I think there's so much for people there between all the topics we've covered, from going from hypothyroidism to the supporting it to the Hashimoto's to what you learned, which I think connects with me in different areas. As someone who had my own health problems, I love that in hearing that story, and being out the other side is even more inspiring. Ina, I've loved this conversation. As I said, I love the work you're doing with the podcast in particular. It's just such a unique formula that you have, and there's so much value in it. And for everyone that's listening, I recommend you go over, if you have any issues with thyroid, with Hashimoto's, go and check out the podcast, Health Mystery Solved. But Ina, is there anywhere else you'd like to send people? Instagram, website, anywhere else that people connect with you? Please give those links now.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So I am mostly on Instagram. It's just at Ina Topiler. And then, yeah, you mentioned the podcast. And then I have my practice as well, which is Complete Nutrition and Wellness. But it's all kind of connected through both of those websites. And on Instagram is the best way to find me and reach me.
Amazing. And for everybody listening, I will link the podcast, I will link the Instagram page, I will link everything we talked about in today's podcast on the show notes on briankeenfitness.com and in the description wherever you are listening to podcasts. Ina, keep doing what you're doing, and thank you so much again for your time.
Of course. And thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here and connect with you again and your audience. So thank you for all of the amazing work that you do.
Pleasure was all mine.